And we're here to talk sort of about with our experiences in public goods funding, decentralized finance. What else? What were the other hot topics we were gonna cover here?
Well, one of the things that I'm particularly excited about and going to talk a bit more about in longer form tomorrow are decentralized physical infrastructure projects, which I think are a very interesting application of the sorts of mechanisms that Protocol Labs is focused on and the space is focused on more broadly to things outside of finance, things like telecom, transportation, things that would otherwise be often government-sponsored utilities and monopolies that I'm very hopeful we can end up having crypto-economic mechanisms to allow normal users and everyday people to own and operate those networks for hopefully much better efficiency.
Yeah. I started looking into DePIN or decentralized sort of networks like this. I worked with Helium really extensively when they started on sort of their governance mechanisms and other things. Sorry, I'm getting a call from friends. And one of the things that I'm curious about, because I don't know a lot about what you've been working on, so it's going to be a little bit exploratory for me as well, is sort of how have you addressed the redundancies in the current infrastructure? So for example, like with subsea cabling for the kind of TradNet, I see that as a major bottleneck in sort of how we approach decentralization in Web3, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that if you have any.
Yeah, I think one answer is to focus on networks that haven't been deployed at the scale that they're needed to be useful. So you mentioned Helium, which deployed a LoRaWAN network, which was not widely deployed at the time, and there were not good incentives to deploy it. And so they were trying to create sort of a net new functionality and doing so in a way that big companies and existing telecom companies were not particularly interested in deploying it at the time. And I think another version of this, Helium and several other decentralized wireless projects have focused on creating 5G networks, which were only really enabled and made feasible by, at least in the US, by CBRS, which is a 2017 law and difference that was passed, creating spectrum that's open to anyone for 5G, instead of having a requirement to go through spectrum auctions and purchase it, which is really only constrained to large companies and enterprises that have typically provided things like wireless communication services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with 5G, it's an interesting, I think, case study because I recall it being a 10-year kind of R&D process and something like $9 billion.
Yes.
And again, that's sort of one of the things that we come up against within Web3 is scaling quickly, and consensus mechanism and mechanism design, I think, is a very important aspect to how we kind of address these dependencies that we hope to have redundancy around.
Yeah, I think one other answer is to focus on specific geographies. So whenever you're dealing with something physical, unlike an Ethereum or a Bitcoin, you can have a meaningful impact by concentration in a specific physical area. And so one version of this is you just focus on an initial target market, much like Uber and Lyft did originally as well. And if you can prove it works in a specific location, then you can expand that model much more broadly. And I think this is perhaps a better or a more practical way to deploy, instead of saying we're just going to write a protocol specification, implement it, and then let anyone sort of have their own small homegrown instance. I would be excited to see more people focus on having concentrated areas where you really show genuine success, both on the supply and demand side of the market, and then expand more broadly afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you see sort of the sustainable, either retroactive or proactive, as I like to call it, revenue models for these things, especially within the context of Filecoin or MEVs? How would you sort of address that?
Yeah, I think what is happening for some of the L2s on Ethereum, Optimism, for example, has a series of retroactive public goods funding airdrops, are an interesting application or instance of how, if a network is generating revenue and there's no clear way to distribute one approach is to use it for public goods funding. And I think this applies to MEV specifically as more networks try to internalize MEV, and this has been a general trend that seems to be the way things are going, instead of taking those funds and either distributing them back to the individual participants in the network. You could, in theory, have it dedicated towards building public goods or complements to the network itself. And that, I mean, I think I am perhaps a bit more applied or sort of commercial, to use a dirty word, than a lot of people in public goods funding. But I think you could almost envision those as being complements to the original network. And a lot of very valuable and useful software has been built as a complement to an otherwise very profitable business. I think you could look at a lot of the open source machine learning frameworks that have helped catalyze the current state we're in as complements to otherwise very successful businesses at companies like Google.
What do you see as sort of successful case studies or examples of current protocol or public goods mechanism funding that's more proactive? And I know like we have a lot of really interesting successful mechanisms in terms of specifically on chain for like retroactive stuff, but I worked in open source hardware and software for about 10 years before I came into crypto, and one of the consistent bottlenecks was we needed to produce proactive models of runway to essentially be able to keep the project viable long enough that we could then kind of generate a sustainable revenue stream, if that was even a possibility within the project. And so I'd be really interested to know from your perspective, as the sort of like the VC commercial dirty word, as you said, of this group, which I'm actually very pro, by the way. If there's specific things that you would like point people to look at.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this will answer your question, so if it doesn't, just call me out on that. I think one thing that I would be very excited to see more of are ways to allow people to contribute permissionlessly to a protocol or to a DAO and be compensated accurately after the fact. And after the fact doesn't mean like a decade from now, but you work for a month and your compensation is determined at the end of the month. And I mean, PL has helped fund and organize a project called SourceCred that I think was one of the best attempts at doing this in recent years. Unfortunately, it hasn't quite worked yet, but I would be very interested in seeing essentially new models of how an organization should hire or compensate people for the work they do. And if that sort of thing can be implemented, my hope would be that you don't need proactive funding. Someone doesn't need to, go to a fund or a public goods grant committee and ask for a year or 2 years of funding for their research or for their work. They can start contributing, and to the extent what they're doing is quite useful, they'll actually receive compensation fairly quickly to continue their work. I'm not sure this always is going to be applicable, because there are some things where it's not a linear stepping stone of like in month one I accomplished this, and as a result there's a tangible outcome. But I am hopeful that more of that will happen, and I also think this will hopefully help alleviate some of the coordination problems of very large decentralized organizations where you don't have the hierarchical structure and sort of middle management, so to speak, of much larger companies.
Yeah, one of the things that I wish I had this tweet pulled up, but I think Kevin might be in the room, so maybe I can call him out. I don't see him. But he said something around, Kevin posted something on Twitter the last few days about one of the things is not the most powerful people are like the anons building the decentralization or like communication mechanism tooling. And that kind of comes back, I think, a lot to governance and the question of how do we delineate funding? Because right now, like most of the funding structures that we have in place are completely obfuscated. They're not on chain. There's no transparency. There's no ability to depend on the sustainability or from the sustainability from the standpoint of actual payouts, not from a green point, by the way, although that should be also included. The sustainability of how we fund developers and projects in a way that's consistent and dependable and repeatable is not something I've seen solved yet. And I'm curious if that sort of aligns with your model as well, or do you see that there's people that have been looking at that from, because again, like Ethereum and Foundation or whatever, Filecoin, wherever we're looking at, they tend to have these massive pots of money, and the biggest issue I see consistently is like, who decides who allocates that? And if it is the community, is that something that they're willing to do, or is that just kind of, they like decentralization and public goods for like the intellectualism of it, but they don't actually want to deploy it in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good question for people at those organizations. Like, I used to work for Evan. That's how I got more interested in crypto in the space. I would agree to some extent that there are often big companies that help facilitate the development of these protocols, or decentralized organizations that have large treasuries, and those could probably be better utilized. One of the reasons I'm excited about allowing permissionless contribution is that hopefully it will reduce the amount of coordination required to make use of those treasuries or grants committees. I think the coordination is frankly quite complicated today. And getting people to not only agree, but first just participate is often quite challenging. So I'm not sure that's, I think there are like very tangible, simple, straightforward things of how do we encourage people to pay attention and how do we create better coordination mechanisms even before you get to like, how do we fund things?
Mm-hmm. And do you have any examples of those that you want to talk about, or?
I mean, I think this sort of event is very positive. Getting people interested and talking about how we create better mechanisms is quite useful. I also think, I mean, a lot of this, like I'm certainly guilty of it. Occasionally we end up talking very intellectually about what is positive and what should we be focused on instead of just actually doing things.
Yeah.
And I think like there is probably not enough focus on like being very pragmatic and very tangible. And, you know, again, perhaps that's my perspective and something that, you know, other people would disagree with me on, but I would be excited to see more people focused on, like, you know, better utilizing the funding mechanisms that we have today.
And from kind of a VC standpoint, I'd be really curious, sitting with sort of within that institutional structure, if you will, how do you approach public goods funding when you're up against funding things that have really tangible returns or like tokens, or there's some kind of equity allocation that has a very high upside, where I think public goods is sort of like a longer bleed, if you will. A lot of the really viable projects are 5 to 15 to 10 year out kind of things, best case. I think 5G is like a good use case if that was to be a public good. It's a long, expensive project, but there's a huge upside to that. So is there like people, or are there people or sort of VC culture, if you will, that is like addressing those things in a way that is specific to like maybe 1% of a fund allocation, or there's some kind of way that they're recognizing that they're contributing to actively? I think VCs get like a very bad rap, but I work with a lot of them and they tend to be genuinely very curious and accessible to the conversation of public goods. And I'm curious if you've seen any like funds specifically, either within your own groups or others who've kind of built out successful models for public good funding within the structure.
I'll say two things. First, none of this is legal tax or investment advice, which I'm obligated to tell you.
Right.
Please, you know, be wary. I think the component of this, like us specifically, me personally, I'm not terribly worried about very long timelines. I think like crypto actually moves much faster than other industries where you see venture capital or similar funding models, and so you can do often a lot more in 2 years in this space than you can in a space like you know, more traditional enterprise software. And so from that perspective, I don't really see as much of the time constraint as perhaps other people. And you know, other people have different approaches that take shorter timelines. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Yeah,
kind of. I think one of the disconnects is like a lot of funding entities and institutions or groups or companies, whatever, that we've worked with has been, well, like, why should I give, 1% of this fund to develop or deploy like a Ruby implementation on Chromium versus like, I don't know, do something that would, inject capital into Airbnb or something that's just like very clean and obvious how that mechanism works, without kind of being able to explain or insinuate sort of what the direct value prop is there?
Yeah, so maybe one way of thinking about this, something we talk about, is the difference between a library and a network. A library being a single player tool that can involve a lot of time and effort to develop and build, but often doesn't have the sort of leverage or scale typically associated with the network, and then things that look more like a network, something that looks more like, Ethereum or Filecoin. And I think it's often much easier to find funding for things that look like a network because they tend to have network effects and tend to have greater leverage. And so I would agree to some extent that oftentimes tools and libraries that are very individually valuable tend not to receive as much attention from different funding methods.
Mm-hmm. We have a minute, I see, or 2 minutes. Is there anything else that you'd like to say? I actually have a lot more questions, so maybe we'll talk after this, but...
No, I'm really excited that everyone came today, and I hope we keep talking about this and solve all these problems.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.